Our speaker tonight, Victoria Miller, a lot of you know her. I think I learn something new every time you talk, so I'm really excited for what you have for us tonight. Can people still get your book, by the way?
Yes.
Is that still okay?
Yes.
So, yeah, it is a really cool book about Pueblo, so I highly recommend getting that. But please help me welcome Victoria.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come and speak tonight. This presentation is probably going to be a little bit different than what you're used to when you come to Startup Pueblo. I'm a historian, so that's what I do. So I'm going to talk about the history of Pueblo and some small businesses, their history that you're familiar with, and then we will talk about the granddaddy of all small businesses, which in my opinion is not small. But we will talk about CF&I as well, which started out as a small business, by the way. So if you're not familiar with Pueblo history, of course, Pueblo traces its roots way back into the 1840s. It actually started as a trading post called Fort Pueblo in 1842 at the confluence of the Fountain River and the Arkansas River, which today is now near El Pueblo History Museum, just a few blocks from where you're sitting right now. It was a trading post for the trappers, the traders, the mountain men, as well as the indigenous people that lived here, mainly Apache, Arapaho, and Ute peoples. So I guess you could consider that a small business, I guess, because you had things that you wanted to trade for. Maybe you wanted to sell your items and get some money. So I guess that could be kind of considered a small business, I guess. It was also an agricultural hub for many ranchers and farmers as well. And this went all the way up through until the 1870s. Right after the American Civil War, of course, the American West opened its doors, and people started flooding from the east into the west. And so that starts the story of this man, General William Jackson Palmer. He originally was from Pennsylvania, and he was a railroad guy. Of course, you know, in that time, you had a method of transportation to bring all of these people that were flooding the West from the East. Wagon trains and stagecoaches, of course, were fabulous. If you wanted to get people out here fast, you needed to build a railroad system. And so he made his way west like other men of his generation. And his dream was to build a railroad line that connected Denver all the way south along the spine of the Rocky Mountains into Mexico. His competitors were all moving east and west. And he thought, if I go north and south, everybody's going to want to ride on my train. I'll make a lot of money, and everything will just be wonderful. So he came out west. He chose Pueblo as a site to build a steel mill to make the railroad tracks locally. And he chose Pueblo and not another city in Colorado because we had a geographically perfect location to coal, iron, water, and limestone. And these were the ingredients needed to make the steel at that time. Trains don't drive well on the dirt. Let's just put it that way, okay? So you had to have a local source. He could have brought railroad tracks out here from the east, but when he got them here, first of all, you had to have a way to get them here. And also, when he got them here, he had to pay a lot of taxes. So he thought, if I build my rails locally, then it'll just save myself a lot of headaches. So he did sort of, I guess in today's world, what's called a SWOT analysis. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? So he thought, okay, strengths are the location for Pueblo, because we had all those resources, the coal, the iron. Iron originally came from the San Luis Valley, so not too far from here. Coal originally came from Los Animas, Huerfano, and Fremont counties, not too far. Water, of course, Arkansas River. And then limestone came from a place called Lime, Colorado, which today we know better as Stem Beach, just a few miles south of town. So that was a strength. Weakness was finding investors to go with them with a project, just like today's businesses. You need to find investors. And so in his generation, the way you found investors was you married one. And so his wife, Mary Mellon, came from an extremely wealthy family. Her father had lots of rich friends. So that's just how you did it back then. Opportunity, of course, people wanted to ride out west. And threats, there really weren't a whole lot because there was no competition out here. His steel mill was what's called the pioneer steelmaker in the West. It was the only one west of the Mississippi River. From its beginnings in the 1870s all the way up through World War II. It was the only one out here. So, of course, no competition. Everything was great. So we started the company as the Colorado Coal and Iron Company in 1872. The first rail came out of the mill 10 years after the company began. And as you know, we are still making rails here in Pueblo more than 150 years later. Just a couple of highlights. Over the life of the company, of course, it made hundreds of different products. Everything from wire, nails, fence posts, bridges. The things that came out of the mills in Pueblo literally built the West. It was a major employer as well. At the peak of the company in the 1950s, they had a payroll of over 22,000 people. They owned several mining operations throughout 6 different western states. They had several subsidiary companies that they owned and operated. Their most famous subsidiary was a company called Roeblings and Sons. Roeblings is the company that built the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. They didn't build it when CF&I owned them. That came many years later. But in the 40s, some of the cables on the bridge were wearing out, and so they were replaced with cables made under the CF&I trademark. They also were a pioneer in industrial relations, in labor relations, industrial technology, as well as in medical practices as well. Here's a very early picture of the company. Shortly after, this picture was probably taken around 1900 or so. Some of these buildings that you see here on this end, this is on the very far north end of the property. Some of these buildings are still standing today. So when you zip past on I-25, take a look at them. So things were going great for Palmer in the early days, and like I said, he really didn't have a whole lot of threats until this guy shows up. His name is John Osgood, and he appears in southern Colorado in 1884. His company was called the Colorado Fuel Company, and its job was to mine coal to sell to people to heat their homes. There was no natural gas heating in the 1880s, and so everybody used coal. And so after some, coal is what's called a non-renewable resource, which means when you dig it out of the ground, it doesn't grow back fast. It takes millions and millions of years to regrow coal. So Palmer's company and Osgood's company were rivals for the same coal source throughout southern Colorado. So after some very careful negotiations and a very hostile takeover, Osgood's company took over Palmer's company, and it drove Palmer out. Palmer then retired, and he decided to focus his efforts on building the city of Colorado Springs. Osgood then became the president of the two companies. He merged them together to become the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, otherwise known as CF&I. So here's a newspaper article when that happened in 1892, and he was pretty cutthroat, as many people are in this line of work, and he really wanted to grow CF&I, not just a little mom and pop type operation, but he really took a lot of Palmer's ideas, and he really wanted to go for the big time. And under his leadership, CF&I really grew from a small little local steel maker into a regional steel maker. Of course, he kind of got a little in over his head. In 1903, the company was more than $17 million in debt, and he had to sell out to the company's majority shareholder, a guy named John Rockefeller. You might have heard of him. So that's another story for another day. So one of the secrets of the company's success was it was built up on a business plan called vertical integration. So I'm assuming you guys are business people, you know what vertical integration is. And so every opportunity that the company had to control something, they did, including medical resources, their mining operations. At every mine, the company also built a town for their employees to live in. Some of these are still functioning towns today. Crested Butte is one of them. Walsenburg is another one. In Fremont County, there's Rockvale, Williamsburg, Coal Creek, and Brookside. So some of them are still around, just not necessarily focused on mining, but they're still functioning towns. You have to remember, this is all happening 140 years ago. Nobody had a car 140 years ago, so you didn't commute to work. That was not a concept yet. They had their own railroad that transported the minerals from different places to Pueblo. Of course, they had company stores in every town. There's no Amazon Prime in 1910. It just wasn't a concept yet.
There was Sears.
Yeah, there was Sears, but not necessarily in southern Colorado. And so, they were just kind of all CF&I all the time. One of their subsidiaries started out actually as what's called Minnequa Hospital. This today is known as whatever you want to call it, St. Mary Corwin, Centura Health, Common Spirit, whatever term you like to use. And the reason for this is steel making and mining are extremely dangerous lines of work. I mean, you deal with temperatures that are measured in the thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. You deal with things that are measured in tons, not in pounds. You have toxic gases. I mean, there's so many ways that you could get hurt or even die on the job. And so the company, starting in 1880, actually formed its own little subsidiary in its own medical department. And that medical department actually still exists today. As you know, St. Mary Corwin Hospital is still functioning. It's no longer owned by the steel mill. They released ownership many, many years ago, and they're their own entity now. But at the steel mill site, they do have first responders that work 24 hours a day, just to care for workers that might get sick or hurt. I guess necessity and invention kind of go hand in hand. It was almost fortuitous because at the time that the steel mill first began, the United States experienced an immigration surge like no other. People came from all over the world to the United States looking for a better life. Some of the small businesses that were formed at the turn of the century were actually formed by immigrants. Walter's Brewery is actually one of them. In the late 1800s, there was a German immigrant by the name of Martin Walter. He came through Ellis Island. He made his way west and he settled in Wisconsin. And he came from a beer brewing family, so he had those skills and knowledge. And in Wisconsin, he and his brothers opened up a brewery. It was very successful, but he wanted to start his own brewery. And so, like many other men of his generation, he traveled further west, and he settled in Pueblo, where he opened up what would later become Walter's Brewery. He chose Pueblo specifically because of the cleanliness of our water. Over the course of his career, his label brewed dozens of labels, and it sold the beer in more than 20 different states, making Pueblo a legend. And one of the reasons I personally think he was so successful is because when you work in the steel industry, you want to drink because it's hot. Like I said, it's measured in the thousands of degrees, the actual steel. The temperature of the room where you make the steel is about 130 degrees year-round. So you get hot really quick. And at the end of the shift, you want something to drink. And so, in the late 1800s, the water isn't necessarily human favorable, but you can drink beer, which has been processed, and it's a lot safer to drink the beer in the 1890s than it is just regular water. Another subsidiary that CF and I helped to form was called the Minnequa Town Company. And like I said earlier, people did not commute to work at the turn of the century because nobody had a car yet. And so the company decided to form this Minnequa Town Company as a real estate company to provide housing for their workers. You had your choice when you went to work for the company. You could have a 3, 4, or a 5-room house. The rent in 1917 was $2 per room per month. The water was free, but oftentimes it was the same water used either in the mill or in the mines, depending on where you lived and where you worked. Each electrical outlet by 1917 was 25 cents. So they charged by how many outlets and how many lamps you had in your house, not by how much usage you had, like we do today. This picture is taken in 1920, and the average house cost the company $700 to build. So. At the turn of the century, CF and I actually made the cover of Scientific American magazine. This is the 1906 cover, and they claimed that in 1906 they had a payroll of over 17,000 people, which at that time, that was about 10% of Colorado's population. So think about that. 1 in 10 people in this state worked for CFI in some capacity. Now that's pretty incredible if you think about that. Of course, things just kept getting better and better for the company. By the 1920s, this was one of their peaks of employment, and they were making, thousands and thousands of tons of steel every year. Rails, wire, nails, just a whole host of a catalog of different products. Of course, this also was fueled by the fact that they had recruiters at the ports of entry to the United States, Ellis Island, Angel Island, which is in California. They had people in Philadelphia, they had people in Baltimore, all these ports of entry. In my opinion, they had like a sign that said, looking for work, come to Pueblo, because there were jobs here. Many immigrants had sponsors, and so they already knew what they were going to do and where they were going to end up. But some people didn't have that kind of idea in their head. They just wanted a job. and so they found their way to Pueblo. And any skill level that you had, any prior experience that you had, CF&I could somehow find you a job somewhere in their operations. This is La Boche de Pueblo. This is the 1920, April 8th of 1927. Of course, when these immigrants came to Pueblo, they brought with them their language, their culture, their religion, their food preferences, which made Pueblo, as you know, extremely diverse and very eclectic. Pueblo at one time had more than a dozen different newspapers written in different languages because of the ethnic diversity that was here. So this is an Italian newspaper. The name of the newspaper is The Voice of the People. If you didn't necessarily work for CF&I, you might have wanted to start your own business to support CF&I workers and their needs. This, of course, is Vegas Shoe Repair. It started in 1919, it actually started by a Hungarian immigrant named Gus Vegas. He came to Pueblo in 1915. He worked at CF&I for 4 years, and this enabled him to earn enough money to start his own business. And so he had dreams of opening a shoe repair shop, which is brilliant, because think about it. In 1919, everybody wore a hat, but you didn't necessarily need a new hat every couple of years. But you do need new shoes every couple of years, because you walk everywhere, right? 1919, very few, you were starting to see cars show up in Pueblo. Not everybody had a car, so you had to walk everywhere. And so that wears your shoes out. So he started a shoe repair shop, which obviously, as you know, is still in business today. And they do very well. I just had some boots resold, and it was very well. So they do quite well. So he actually, Gus, when he started the business, he trained his son William, to kind of be in the family business at age 9. And he grew up learning the shoe business, and then his son grew up learning the shoe business, and so it's been, I think they're on their 5th generation now. These are some other, I didn't know if any of you guys are into historic advertising. These are some ads that were in different Pueblo newspapers in 1926, kind of showing the diversity of different businesses. Again, you know, there were thousands of people in Pueblo at that time, and they all needed different services. As many of you know, if you are familiar with Pueblo history, in 1921, we had a little flood here. Actually, it was a big flood. And so that's actually how Gagliano was started. The Gagliano family was started by 2 brothers, and they were immigrants from Italy. And they actually started, they came here about a month or so after the flood happened. And they started selling milk door to door. And then that, of course, inspired them to open up an actual store in a neighborhood on Elm Street that was predominantly Italian. As I mentioned before, people came from all over the world to Pueblo, and they tended to settle in neighborhoods where people spoke your language, your religion, your cultural values, etc. Well, in a predominantly Italian neighborhood, there were no other stores that would provide goods and services that were catering to the Italian population. So, you know, like a polenta pot, or you know, things that people who cook Italian food on a regular basis would need, but they didn't necessarily have access to it. Remember, no Amazon Prime yet. So the Gagliano brothers opened up this store in 1921, and as you are familiar, they just celebrated their 100th anniversary a couple of years ago. great in Pueblo in the 20s until October of 1929 when the stock market crashed. And you know, the average wage in the 20s was about, for Americans, was about $2,000 a year. But people were starting to use credit cards, and like today, some people get in over their head. And they had this kind of mentality that the money will always be there, and that caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. When they realized that they didn't have the money anymore, of course they stopped spending and supporting the smaller businesses, and that caused even more problems. You guys know how the stock market crashes and it creates a ripple effect across all types of industries, including wage cuts and layoffs. So CF&I in 1935 actually experienced its second bankruptcy. First bankruptcy happened in John Osgood's time at the turn of the century. 1935, people were not buying steel or other steel products, and so CF&I actually had its second bankruptcy in 35. They reorganized in 1936. They changed the name of the company from Colorado Fuel and Iron Company to Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, changed their letterhead, and then they kept on going. Obviously it bounced back when the economy improved. The company knew that in the 1929 and early 30s there were a lot of problems, so they started publishing its own sales magazine for the first time. It was called Turnover, so Turnover or Profit, and within it, it was basically all advertising. It was sold to, as a subscription, to their farmers and ranchers, figuring farmers and ranchers need fencing, they need nails, they need barbed wire, that type of thing from us, because where else are you going to get it? And so that's what this magazine mainly is focused on, is selling to the farmers and the ranchers, small businesses. Things eventually turned around. Of course, in the late 20s and early 30s, we had what was called Prohibition in this country, where you couldn't necessarily buy a drink. But that's basically how Eilers formed, as well as Gus's taverns. They were located in predominantly the Slovenian type neighborhood called Bojontown, unofficially. Eiler Heights is the official name for it. But they both started out as grocery stores. When Prohibition ended and they could sell liquor again, the way that Eilers actually started was, it was started by Matt Glavich and his wife Josephine. They had the grocery store, and Matt actually succumbed to pneumonia and he died, and Josephine wanted to continue on the business, and so she had 2 barrels and a hunk of wood, and she put it down and got her liquor license. She was in line at the courthouse in 1933 when Prohibition ended. She was in line right behind the guy who owned Gus's. So Gus's had the first liquor license, and Eilers had number 2. But they continued on with the bar part of their operation. As you know, both are still very successful businesses. So here's another couple of pictures of things that were made in the 1930s by CF&I, just specifically for farmers and ranchers, not necessarily other types of businesses. And there's another couple of pages from the Turnover magazine. Because because farming and ranching, yes, it's a pretty lucrative career path, but it didn't sustain CF&I as well as it did in the 20s, just selling to that demographic. And so CF&I actually had to lay off about half of their employee base during this time. But they knew, because so many people depended on CF&I to live, that they would help them out. Luckily at this time, CF&I had its own YMCA, and that provided classes for people to learn skills and hobbies, things such as car seat cover making. They taught them how to sew. As you can see, these ladies here are wearing dresses that were that they learned how to sew in a class offered at the Y. They had lampshade making classes, so they could learn skills for sustainability during the time that they were laid off. This is a rug weaving class here. They learned how to weave a rug that they could hopefully sell to somebody to earn a little bit of money. CF&I also worked with local and state government during the late 30s in what was called the Workmen's Progress Administration, the WPA projects, because you had all these people unemployed. They needed something to do, and so the government created this program to give some jobs to people who needed work. And so as a result, these buildings that you see in these pictures were a result of the WPA projects. So they did things like the building of the arch at Mountain View Cemetery at the corner of Northern and Acero. This is at Mineral Palace Park. State Fairgrounds, a lot of the buildings at the fairgrounds were built as a result of that program. This is City Hall here, and the Pueblo Zoo, that wall that goes around the zoo, that rock wall, was built as a WPA project as well. A couple other pictures, steps at Keating School, and sidewalk repair project at Spruce and Minnequa streets. In the 40s, the economy started bouncing back, and it was good times again for CF&I, which of course brought people back to work. You can see this picture here was taken in the late 40s. Look at all the cars in the parking lot here for people that are working. And it was good times for the next 20 or so years. And of course, this is when, because the economy was bouncing back, small businesses formed again, and people started buying homes, which of course gave real estate agents work, construction people work, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of subdivisions were also developed during this time. So like Sunset Park, Belmont, University Park, those neighborhoods were developed during this time. Then in the 60s, we had another down. We were going up, and then we had another down. CF&I, for the first time in its history, experienced foreign competition, particularly from India and China, and that really dipped into CF&I's profits a lot. The worries started in the 60s, and they just continued for the next 3 decades. By the time of the 70s, Congress had passed a lot of clean water and clean air laws that forced CF&I to upgrade technology, start using electric-powered furnaces rather than the coal-powered furnaces that they had been using for the previous century. Those technology upgrades cost a lot of money. Think about every couple of years, you have to get a new phone. It's a couple $100. Or if you buy an iPhone, it's like $1,000. Think about a company the size of CF&I having to upgrade technology. I mean, millions and millions of dollars had to be spent. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, the folks who started working here in the 40s and 50s, when it was at its peak, it was time to retire. And they all wanted their pensions all at the same time. because of those other two problems, there just wasn't money in the bank to meet those pension obligations. And the United States at that same time, I mean, it wasn't just Pueblo, it was nationwide. All the steel mills started experiencing the same types of problems. And so we had a steel recession in the United States in the early 80s. In 1982 and 83, I don't know if any of you were in Pueblo at the time. I don't know if you remember. It was not a good time to be in Pueblo.
I was living, as a matter of fact, on the other side of Northern Bridge.
Yeah, it was not a good time to be in Pueblo. We had what was called the Big Layoff. And so in 1982 and 83, Pueblo actually had, as you can see, 18% unemployment. And that, of course, causes a ripple effect throughout all the other industries because Pueblo was so dependent on basically one industry. I mean, they had others, but mainly one, and that was a steel mill. In 1987, to kind of regroup and kind of get things back, the company did offer what's called an ESOP. It's the Employee Stock Option Plan, to kind of have more shareholders own more pieces of the pie, basically, rather than by one person controlling everything, or just a handful of people controlling. And because of all those major layoffs, a lot of other mom and pop businesses formed. Many people opened up trash companies. So I don't know if you know, but Pueblo has a lot of trash companies, a lot of competition because of the things that happened in the 80s. The other option, maybe if you didn't want to open a trash company, maybe you wanted to open a restaurant. So this is how the mill stop started. Was Mr. Mares was laid off from the mill in the early 80s. Whoops. And he thought, well, you know, what's my other option to have some money coming in? Well, I have Grandma Stella's recipe for sopapillas, and so that's how that restaurant started. I already kind of gone into this. The company officially filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November of 1990 because of those three reasons that we talked about earlier. And this is a little quote from Frank Yaklich, who was the president of the time, of the company at the time. You know, he did everything that he possibly could to stall the bankruptcy. I mean, they froze wages, they you know, did all kinds of different things. They started that ESOP, the stock option plan. Let's see, as you can see, you know, they had all these other things that they tried. Unfortunately, it was not a success. In April of, in February of 1993, a new company officially closed on the purchase of CF&I. It was called Oregon Steel Mill, and they ran the company for the next several years. I'm getting close.
Yeah,
anyway.
you did great.
And then in 2006, a company called Evraz North America purchased Oregon Steel Mills, and just earlier this summer, a company called Orion purchased Evraz North America, and so that's who operates the mill today. So, and you know, many of these small businesses that formed out of that tragedy in the 80s, like Mill Stop, are still going strong today.